Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror, I'm going to do something a bit different from things I've done before and a bit more ambitious. I'm going to tell you 30 horror novels that you need to read before you die. So I've been thinking about doing a video like this for a while. And was reflecting back on my years of reading horror. So I've been reading horror since I was kind of 12 or 13, which is over 35 years. So I've got a bit of form reading horror. And I thought it would be an interesting experiment to come up with a list of what I thought were horror novels that were really good, but also broadly representative of the genre. So I've come up with this list, and what I've done is I've come up with a list of 15 different styles of horror. So they're not exactly subgenres, they're not really tropes exactly, but they're different types of horror fiction. So I've come up with a list of 15 of them, and for each of those 15 types I've come up with 2 books. So hopefully, even if you've read one of the books, you won't have read the other one. And if you're new to the genre, it gives you a bit of breadth to look into. And what I've tried to do, and I haven't managed to do this with all 15, but what I've tried to do for each one is give you a fairly well-known book and then a less well-known book as well. So this is my list of 30 horror novels that I think are definitely worth your time if you're already a fan of the genre or if you want to get into the genre. What I would say is I'm very conscious that this list is a fairly male list and a fairly white list, and that's really, I guess, down to the nature of the kind of horror I read, particularly in my formative years as a horror reader in the 80s and 90s, when white male authors were really dominated the genre. I think they still do dominate it to an extent, but it's fantastic to see so many authors of colour and female authors and LGBTQ authors coming through as well. And all of those groups are represented in this list, but probably not represented as much as they would be if someone who was younger was doing the list, whose formative years of reading horror are happening now. So I think it's fantastic that we're seeing authors like V. Castro, like Stephen Graham Jones, like P. Djeli Clark, really coming out in the genre now and becoming big names, because I think all 3 of those are fantastic authors. None of them have made this list, so spoiler alert, none of them have made this list because I think they are all still new enough, if you like, that they haven't necessarily found their voices yet fully. So this is my list. I don't claim it to be comprehensive. I'm sure everyone will have different opinions on books I've missed that I should have included. But yeah, this is my almost like a starter list of 30 books that I think are definitely worth your time. Okay, so let's go through the 15. So the first one is a fairly broad category, so it's short stories. So I have got 2 here, 2 authors here who I think have produced a fantastic body of horror short stories that really are important to the genre, and those 2 are H.P. Lovecraft, so one of the kings of the horror genre, a massively important figure, and also the first horror author that I read. So I'm not going to single out any particular short stories by Lovecraft, because to be honest with you, they're all pretty good. He wrote dozens and dozens. He pretty much single-handedly created the subgenre of cosmic horror, and his work is definitely worth looking into. And also I think one of the things that's great about Lovecraft is you don't need to read his stuff in any particular order. So whilst most of his books are or many of his stories are within what's termed the Cthulhu mythos, you can read any of them. You don't need to read them in order to get value out of them. And then another more modern author I would recommend in the short story field is Clive Barker. So Clive Barker's 6-volume Books of Blood series from the 80s is just phenomenal. Really daring, challenging horror. Quite unlike anything really that had come before it. Fantastically enjoyable. fantastically gory in places, really disturbing in places, but again, definitely worth reading. Okay, so next up is a type of horror I've loosely termed classic monsters. So the first of these will probably come as no surprise. That's Dracula by Bram Stoker. So despite being, a pretty old book, well over 100 years old, it is still fantastically readable. The fact that it's written in, kind of diary entries and letters and things like that gives it a kind of found footage type feel. And it's really very accessible and very entertaining still, and definitely a really important novel in the genre. Something a bit more modern, from the 80s I believe, is Moondance by S.P. Somtow, which is a werewolf novel. Now werewolf novels are fairly rare, to be honest with you, and there aren't that many great examples of them, but this definitely is. So it's a long, kind of sprawling, it's got something of an epic feel to it, but it's also incredibly kind of earthy. It's very gory, it's got tons of sex in it, which is something that sometimes books tend to have, but it's got this really raw, earthy feel to it that I think really captures the heart of what the werewolf genre is about. Next up then, something completely different, so a kind of killer kids subgenre, if you like. So two extremely disturbing books here that I have talked about on the channel before. The first one is The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. The second is Let's Go Play at the Adams by Mendal Johnson. So both of these books are about children imprisoning kind of teenagers and torturing them. So both are, very disturbing reads. The Girl Next Door is definitely the more famous of the two. But Let's Go Play at the Adams, I think, is just as good, if not better. So they're both books that really explore the darker side of human nature in a way that really only the horror genre can. Both fantastically difficult books to read, but both excellent. Next up, no list of horror will be complete without serial killers. So two books that I think are classics of the genre, or subgenre rather, are Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. So obviously fantastically well known, particularly because of the film version of it, but a really great kind of, I never know if it's a horror novel or a crime novel. I think it kind of bridges the gap between those two genres. But fantastically exciting and readable, and really one of those books that helped define what that type of literature was going to be like. So that the kind of forensic analysis and that kind of thing that has become such a mainstay of the crime genre. The Silence of the Lambs does it fantastically well. And also that kind of, I guess it's pop psychology really, but it works brilliantly. Something very different is By Reason of Insanity by Shaun Stevens. So a lesser known book, one from the 80s, about a serial killer on the run basically, but incredibly gritty and disturbing. Shaun Stevens is a fantastically dark writer. It's a much darker book than Silence of the Lambs. A very different tone, but I think another excellent book. Okay, moving on then to what I guess I would kind of call nostalgic horror. So there was a big wave of this in the 80s, when horror writers, the big horror writers were kind of starting to approach middle age, and were harking back to their childhoods and teenage years. I think the best known example of this is It by Stephen King, which takes a group of characters from the 50s, when they were children, and talks about events that happened to them then, and then describes them as adults in the 80s as well. So it is a book that many of you will have read already. I think it's for all its faults, and it does have faults, I think it's a fantastic novel. Still quite scary, definitely very gripping despite its huge length, and definitely well worth. It really deserves its the respect it has within the genre, I think. Another book which came out at very much the same time, which I think has that similar kind of nostalgic feel to it, and is also fantastic, and in fact I think it's probably better than it, is Summer of Night by Dan Simmons, which again tells the story of a group of a group of kind of young kids in the past, so again set in the 50s, I think, like it, up against evil, so taking on small town evil and trying to vanquish it. So another fantastically enjoyable novel. Moving on, let's have a bit more Stephen King. So I'm terming this one kind of post-apocalyptic horror. So obviously the King novel I'm going to talk about here is The Stand, which again, you know, like it has many faults, but is still a fantastically enjoyable read. You know, definitely a mammoth, over 1,000 pages, and you know, tells the story of a variety of different characters struggling to survive after a flu pandemic has wiped out most of the population of the world. But has a, you know, a kind of epic fantasy feel to it as well, in terms of its story of a battle between good and evil. Similar in many ways, and definitely I think an equal of The Stand, again if not better, is Swan Song by Robert R. McCammon. So this one, rather than taking a pandemic as its apocalypse, has a nuclear war, and again talks about you know, groups of different characters trying to survive after that. Again, it's got that kind of almost biblical feel to it that The Stand has, but it's just a really enjoyable fantasy novel, fantasy horror novel, and extremely gripping at times. He's a fantastic writer of action, Robert McCammon, and it really shows in this book. Okay, moving on, a particular favourite of mine is the kind of animals attacking, or you know, when animals attack type subgenre of horror. So I've got two British novels for you here, both of which I think are fantastic, and both of which I read as a teenager and have reread more than once since then. So the first is The Rats by James Herbert, which pretty much invented the subgenre of, you know, many animals attacking rather than just one animal. So Peter Benchley, you know, obviously did a fantastic job of the one animal attacking with Jaws. James Herbert does it brilliantly with The Rats. So a really gritty, I've described it in the past as kind of a punk horror novel, in that it feels quite anti-establishment, and it's got a very gritty portrayal of kind of post-war London. So it's a London that's full of kind of bomb craters and things like that, with these rats rampaging through kind of run-down city streets. It's got a school teacher as a hero, so a guy who's a bit of a rebel, who ends up going up against the rats along with people from the government. But yeah, fantastically gory, fantastically dark and enjoyable. James Herbert really doesn't take any prisoners in this book. He's willing to let anybody die to tell his story. Something a bit less dark and a bit more fun, but just as good, is Slugs by Shaun Hutson. So, you know, one of the wave of books that came after The Rats. This one came, you know, a good few years after The Rats, so in the early 80s. But a book that is just an absolute blast from beginning to end. So completely ridiculous in its tale of slugs attacking people, given that slugs are fairly small and move very slowly, but he managed to have an enormous amount of fun with it. It is fantastically gory, and he goes to great pains to set up you know, really complicated set piece gore scenes. Hutson is a fantastic writer, I think, always entertaining, and The Slugs is one of his best books. Both of these were the first books that those authors published, and I think both of them are fantastic. Moving on, another kind of subgenre that Herbert kind of pretty much invented, I think, and I don't really know what to call this one, but it's the subgenre of horror where basically people get infected with something and go mad and kill each other. So kind of a bit like zombie apocalypse, but not actual zombies, just people going crazy. So Herbert's entry for this is The Fog. So in which this strange dense fog gradually kind of glides across England, capturing people and sending them mad. So like The Rats, fantastically gory. He's willing to do anything to his characters. There are some very disturbing scenes, but it is a fantastically enjoyable horror novel. His plotting is quite, I don't know what the word is, slow and boring, shall we say, at times. But it's more than worth sticking with for the gore scenes, which are just brilliant. In a similar vein, So I don't think quite as good, but I couldn't do a list like this without including Richard Laymon. So One Rainy Night by Richard Laymon has a similar premise. So in this, it's a rainstorm that sends people crazy in a small town in America. But like like most Laymon books, it has that thoroughly entertaining kind of B-movie vibe to it. So it's nonsense, it's nonsense, but you can't stop reading. It's full of violence, it's full of sex, it's completely nuts, but Laymon just does this kind of thing really well. And I've criticised him on the channel before for being a terrible writer, and he is a terrible writer, but he's also a very enjoyable writer. Okay, next, something completely different. So this is, I would kind of call weird horror, I guess. So two quite different books here. The first one, House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski, which I reviewed on the channel very recently. So this is an absolutely bonkers book. The actual story in this is quite simple. So it's about a very strange house and people's reaction to that house. So both the people that live in it and then later on people who hear about the house. But the way he tells that story is incredibly bizarre in that the book itself is someone describing a film of the events that took place in the house. So this guy lives in the house where weird stuff happens. He films it and releases that as a film. Somebody then writes a book about that film, so describing that film. Somebody else finds that book, which hasn't yet been published, and writes loads of footnotes for it, and then a group of editors find that book and write footnotes about the footnotes. So an incredibly dense and complicated book, very weirdly laid out in places, quite strange and difficult to read, but I think fantastic. Completely different to that, but equally weird, is The Cipher by Kathe Koja, which is written in a completely traditional style, but a very weird book about this young couple I think it's in New York, I might be wrong, in a city in America anyway, who find in the basement of the apartment building they live in this weird hole, which they call the fun hole, which kind of goes nowhere. And just very weird stuff ensues. It's one of those books that just really sticks with you. I can't even explain why, but there's something just bizarre and uncanny about it that is genuinely creepy. So yeah, a thoroughly recommended book, and has been recently republished. Next up, couldn't do a list like this without Haunted Houses. So two of those, both of these I think are reasonably well-known ones. So first, The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. So Shirley Jackson is a fantastic horror author, I think, and The Haunting of Hill House I think is her best horror novel. So a haunted house story, but one where you never really know if the house is haunted or not, or if it's just the perception of the people in it. So a kind of psychologist and a group of like sample subjects go and stay in this supposedly haunted house, and weird stuff ensues. So a really intriguing and disturbing and psychologically complex book, absolutely fantastic. Next up, so again, a haunted house book. This one I think much more traditional, and again very well known. So The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. So a short book, but fantastically atmospheric. So it has a kind of Victorian setting, as befits many classic ghost stories, but incredibly tense, incredibly creepy, just wonderfully done. Moving on then, so more ghosts but not haunted houses. So two examples of kind of classic haunting stories that are not set in haunted houses. So the first, one of my very favourite books, and certainly one of my favourite horror novels, is The Shining by Stephen King. So the story of The Shining, a haunted hotel, a man and his family staying there, the man haunted by his own demons, so his own alcoholism, and just the tension in this book builds up beautifully. I think it's a really excellent horror novel, and also a very deep investigation of King's own struggles with alcohol and drugs. Something of a kind of similar age, Ghost Story by Peter Straub. So again a story about a haunting, but in this case it's a group of friends haunted by something that happened in the past. It's a long book, it's quite slow, but it works brilliantly. Just a gradual ramp up of tension and terror, you know, building up to a fantastically chilling climax. Okay, next, the kind of Southern Gothic. So there's a few books I've talked about here which I think are kind of in the Gothic tradition. Southern Gothic is, you know, the American take on that, and is, you know, a big part of the horror genre, really. So 2 books for you here. Another one by Shirley Jackson, so We've Always Lived in the Castle, which is just a wonderfully weird and chilling, but it's not really chilling, it's more unsettling, I suppose, book about just this strange family and events that have happened in their past, again coming back to haunt them, but it's just beautifully done. It's almost feels like a comedy in manners at times rather than a horror story, but very effective. And then next up, a series of books I've talked about on the channel before. So the Blackwater series by Michael McDowell. So 6 books that were published one a month over 6 months back in the 80s, which taken together form a fantastic kind of family saga with some very weird horror elements to it as well. So set in a small town in the south, where this rich family, the Kathe family, kind of pretty much run the town, and a mysterious young woman gets introduced into the family, and very weird stuff starts happening after that. But a really enjoyable series that has, you know, recently been republished by Valancourt Books, and is definitely worth looking at. Okay, we are nearing the end now. Three of my categories to go. So the first of those is possession novels. So the first book I'm going to talk about, probably again no surprise, The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. You know, a fantastic novel of you know, the struggle between good and evil. A great book about, you know, religion and possession, and, you know, very famously filmed, obviously, but a book that really stands up in its own right as well, even if you've seen the movie. So, you know, very weird, very tense, some fantastically disturbing scenes, you know, definitely rightly thought of as a classic of the genre. And then a book that is similar in many ways, actually came out earlier and not quite so well known, is The Case Against Satan by Ray Russell. So whereas The Exorcist is a very dramatic or melodramatic book, really, that, you know, throws all sorts of weird stuff at you, The Case Against Satan is much subtler, and like The Haunting of Hill House, you never really know whether or not something supernatural is happening or not. So it's about a priest and a young girl who's been possessed, or a couple of priests actually, and a young girl who's been possessed, or who they believe has been possessed, and about their attempts to exorcise the perceived demon from her. So yeah, again, very disturbing, incredibly readable, quite a short book, but yeah, thoroughly recommended. Okay, the penultimate subject then is what I would call kind of cursed art. So 2 fantastic books here for you. So the first is Ring by Koji Suzuki. So again, obviously very famously filmed, both in its native Japan and then later in Hollywood. So a book about a cursed videotape that dooms anyone who watches it, despite the fact that obviously in the book you never get to see the videotape, which you do in the movie. It's a very effective and disturbing book. I love cursed art books. I love that style of horror, and this is a very good example of it. And then again, another one about a cursed film is Night Film by Marissa Pessel. So this is a long weird book about you know, this very strange film that has been made by this director, and about people trying to find the director and find the film. It's very disturbing in places. There's one scene in particular fairly early on which creeped me out hugely. Less well known than The Ring, but just as good in my opinion, and definitely worth looking up. Okay, so the final section then is comedy horror, basically. So I think comic horror works brilliantly in films, and there are many examples of extremely funny horror films. So things like, you know, the Evil Dead series, the early films of Peter Jackson. You know, there's some great horror comedies out there. I think it's less common and less frequently well done in prose, in fiction, but there's a couple of really good examples that I think you should check out. So the first of these is John Dies at the End by David Wong, which is a very weird book. It's just consistently bizarre and amusing. So basically it's these two kind of wasted guys going up against interdimensional monsters, but it's just batshit crazy and very funny. There's two sequels which I have to confess I haven't read yet, which I need to get to, but he's a very entertaining writer. The other one, and there's also a great film of John Dies at the End, which is, you know, definitely worth watching. Much less well known is a self-published book which I think is fantastic, The Coming Thing by Anne Bilson. So this is about it's a bit like it's kind of like Chuck Jones does Rosemary's Baby. So it's about a woman who is pregnant and is trying to have an abortion, who finds that people at this weird cult keep on trying to stop her getting to the abortion clinic. It's just fantastically odd and very funny. So the horror in it and the gore in it is incredibly kind of slapstick in nature. There's some brilliant set pieces in there, and Anne Bilson, like Shaun Hutson in The Slug, goes to great lengths to really set things up beautifully for these very amusing but incredibly violent set pieces. So yeah, another comic horror book that had me laughing out loud as well as being gripped and slightly nauseated. So that was my list of 30 horror novels that I think, or 30 horror books that I think you should read before you die. I don't know how you're going to die, maybe at the hands of a serial killer, or killer slugs, or Dracula, who knows. But yeah, these are 30 books that I think are well worth your time if you're a fan of the genre and haven't read them already. Do let me know what you think of the list. As I said at the start, I'm sure everyone will have their own opinion. So let me know about books you think I've missed. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them. As always, hope you're safe and well. Hope you are reading good stuff out there, and I will speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.